All right, so how you guys doing? Now, my name is ShadeedWallace-Stepter, and I know that's a mouthful, so I'll go by Sha. So today, I'm an entrepreneur and filmmaker who founded a media company, and I'm also an open source enthusiast who learned how to program using Python. I'm here to talk about why I think Python in the open source community is so valuable to people like me. So 14 months ago, I was in San Quentin State Prison, serving a 27-year-to-life sentence for assault with a firearm. My junior year in high school, I shot a man and almost killed him during the commission of a robbery. Now I'm gonna say that again because I wanna be very clear, not only about what I did, but also about who I was at that time in my life. So my junior year in high school, not only was I carrying a gun, but I used that gun to, one, commit strong arm robbery, and two, rob and nearly kill the person that I was robbing. So how did I get to that point? How did I become the violent teenager who was capable and willing to take somebody's life? I mean, I wasn't born like that, and I didn't wake up one morning and decide that I'm gonna start robbing people with guns and shooting them. So how did I get there? My story starts in San Francisco, where I'm from. I grew up in a low-income community surrounded by people that look like me. Unfortunately, San Francisco doesn't look like that anymore. Now, the earliest thing I remember was when I was 6 years old. Now, I remember this age very clearly because this is when I found out that my dad wasn't my biological father. I found out that my dad was not my biological father, but that he was the biological father of my older brother and my younger brother. This news was devastating because my dad was the man. I was obsessed with him, and that's who I wanted to be. And I remember when I found this out, how unfair it felt to me, but also that there wasn't one thing that I could do to change the situation. I was powerless, and I was helpless to do anything about it. As you will see, these feelings of powerlessness, helplessness, and even understanding where I belonged will become themes that I would struggle with through most of the early part of my life. But it all started in that moment. Not long after this, my parents separated, and me and my brothers left with my mom and moved in with my aunt. Now, my aunt, at this time, which was the 80s, was a drug dealer, and her home was a place that crack was manufactured and sold day and night. Between our family, my aunt's family, her and her 4 kids, and the 3 or 4 extended family members that came and went as they pleased, there were at least 13 people staying in our 3-bedroom house at any given time. Also during this time, my mom started smoking crack cocaine. And what's crazy about that is that my aunt was the person that was selling it to her. A few years later, when I was about 8 years old, our home was raided and my mom was arrested for fraud-related charges. Seeing my mom marched off in handcuffs and put into the back of a cop car again left me feeling powerless and helpless. During my mom's incarceration, me and my brothers moved in with their dad. Now, this was a very difficult time for me because I convinced myself that their dad didn't love me like he did my brothers because I wasn't his kid. And I had a terrible time trying to figure out where I belonged. And again, I felt powerless and helpless to do anything about it. But this dramatically affected my behavior, which manifested mostly while I was at school. I became a very disruptive little boy, and I would get sent home almost every day for fighting. So we stayed with my brother's dad for about 2 years, which was the length of my mom's incarceration. And when my mom got back out, me and my brothers moved in with her. So my mom was out for a while, then she gets in trouble again and goes back to jail. This time during her incarceration, myself and my younger brother moved in with a relative, and my older brother moved back in with his dad. Now, this was the first time in my life that I had ever lived anywhere without my big brother, and I had a hard time handling it. I felt like it was unfair that I couldn't be with my big brother, and again, I felt like I was powerless to do anything about it. Now, this was a significant time in my life because my behavior really started to spiral. I continued to act out in school, and I note this time because this is when I first started committing crimes outside of my home. I began vandalizing and destroying property, and I also started shoplifting. Now, this was pivotal for me because what I found was that it felt good to do these things. It felt good because a sense of control came with doing them, and it felt great to be in control of something finally. It was empowering, and I became addicted to this feeling. So when my mom gets back out of jail, we moved into a new place, and my older brother moves back in with us. Now, my older brother was about 15 at the time, which is 3 years older than me. And when he moved back in, my older brother was a completely different person. My older brother was now a gang member who sold drugs, brought home guns, stole cars, and broke into houses. Whenever I got the chance, I would try to tag along with him and his gang member friends. And what my young eyes saw during these times was nothing short of mesmerizing. I saw young people, not much older than me, who weren't struggling to fit in. No one was making them feel like they didn't belong, and they accepted each other. They were taking care of themselves, and they were confident. And what I started to pick up on was where this confidence was coming from. I thought it came from the lifestyle that they were living. And this lifestyle, to me, must have been empowering. So just as I'm starting to get a handle on all of this, my older brother gets arrested, and his arrest was a very big deal. He and 2 members of my extended family were on their way to rob a bank because that's what they were doing at the time. On their way to the bank, they stopped off to get gas. And according to my older brother, they didn't like the service that they got, so they stuck the place up. This resulted in a high-speed chase that ends on the front lawn of my house. Now, during this time, my mom was picking me up from a friend's house. And so when we get home, what we saw was, 1, what looked like every cop in the city on our front lawn. And 2, my older brother, handcuffed on his stomach with a cop on his back, repeatedly slamming his head into the ground. Now, while all of this is happening, my entire neighborhood came out to watch. And so when I got to school the next day, my older brother had effectively become a living legend. He was all that everybody talked about. He was the only thing everybody talked about. And all people talked about was how that scene was the dopest thing that they had ever saw in their life. So after hearing this, I decided that I wanted that admiration, I wanted that praise, I wanted that respect for myself. But I decided that I was going to create an image and persona that was independent of my big brothers. I decided that when he got out of jail, he wasn't going to see me as his little brother anymore. He was going to see me and he was going to respect me as his peer. So that summer, I started hanging out with this kid I met in elementary school. Now, this kid was a neighborhood knucklehead, and he introduced me to the drug trade. He showed me how to cook crack, cut it up, package it, and sell it. He also gave me my first gun. Man, selling drugs, making money, and providing for myself, that lifestyle finally left me feeling empowered. I felt like that was where I belonged, and those old feelings of powerlessness and belonging were replaced with confidence and acceptance. So me and this kid became best friends, and that summer was the first time that I made $1,000. I was 13 years old. Now that was an action-packed summer filled with people. Now that was an action-packed summer filled with seeing people get shot, running from the police. I discovered girls, and most importantly, I finally started to feel like I belonged somewhere. Now fast forward a year, I'm 14. My older brother was out of jail, and me and my best friend are heavy in the drug trade. One night, I'm walking home from a park in my neighborhood, and as I'm walking down the street, I walk past a parked car, and there is this guy hanging out of the passenger side window of that car with an AK-47 pointed at me. He then says my best friend's name because he thought that was me. We lock eyes and stare at each other for a moment, and then he smiles and says, "I thought you were somebody else." And he then gets back in the car. So I walk about a block to a liquor store where I see my older brother sitting on the hood of his car. As I'm explaining to him what just happened, we then hear a string of gunshots. A few moments later, my best friend comes running from around the corner. And then he does something really strange. So he runs around my brother's car past me, comes around on the other side past my brother, and then he sits next to me on the hood of the car. He then puts his head on my shoulder, and I can feel him exhale. But then I didn't feel him breathe anymore. Next thing I know, my brother violently grabs me off the car and basically drags me home. What I didn't see was that my best friend had been shot in the back of the head. And the reason why he was acting so strange was because his body was in shock. He took his last breath on my shoulder. But my brother had seen the gunshot wound on the back of my friend's head, and that's why he grabbed me like he grabbed me and took me home. As we were walking home, I remember my brother being pissed, and he kept yelling at me over and over, "Don't ever let nobody do that to you." My best friend's body wasn't found until the next morning. And when they found him, he was still sitting on the hood of the car in the same position that we left him. His death really impacted me. The shame and guilt that came from feeling like I could have done more, from leaving him there alone on my brother's car. I hated how powerless and helpless I always felt. And I just got tired of feeling that. I got tired of feeling weak. I got tired of feeling like there was nothing that I can do to change anything. So I took my brother's words of never letting anybody do that to me to heart. In that moment, I made the decision that I would never let anybody hurt me, and if they tried, I would kill them. With adopting this mentality, I developed a numbness to my guilt, to my shame, and especially to the feelings of powerlessness and helplessness. This numbness created the space for me to become a very violent person. I remember being completely detached from what I felt. By the time high school rolled around, there were so many people I knew that had either been shot or killed. I was carrying a gun with me everywhere I went, and violence had become an accepted way of life. My junior year in high school, I shot a man and almost killed him during the course of a robbery. Now I was eventually arrested and put on trial. And from day one, I was in complete denial about what I had done. I not only professed my innocence in court, but I also denied it to myself. I was unwilling to take responsibility for my actions. But all that changed when my trial started. Now, going through trial was probably the most traumatic thing that I had ever experienced. Being the center of all that attention from the jury, from the judge, from the DA, and sitting there as they lay out this argument of why you should be taken away from society, and in my case, taken away for the rest of my life. It was a lot. But then what was really crazy about this situation was when I started to realize that the argument that they were making was working. Now, two things happened at trial that brought me crashing back to reality and out of the haze that I had been in for the past few years. The first thing happened when the man that I shot testified. Now, what's crazy about this is that although I was completely responsible for shooting him, he testified that I didn't do it. He testified that he didn't know who shot him, but he was pretty sure that it wasn't me. He then went on to talk about being shot. When I shot him, a bullet went through his hand and shattered the bone in his thumb. Another bullet struck him and lodged in his brain. This left him paralyzed on the left side of his body. He then talked about the migraine headaches that he had and how he had to take medication almost every day just to get through the day. Because of his injuries, he lost his job, and he would never be able to provide for himself or his two kids in the way that he used to. He couldn't pick his kids up and hold them like he used to, and he couldn't dress himself without assistance. He then talked about the months of physical therapy that he had to go through and how he had to learn to walk again. I forever changed his life. After listening to him testify, I couldn't ignore or avoid what I had done. I had to face it. I was responsible for everything that he was going through, and he did not deserve what I did to him. An overwhelming sense of shame just washed over me, and it made me accept the fact that I was wrong, and whatever was going to happen to me as a result of my trial, I had it coming. Now, the second thing that brought me crashing back to reality also happened while I was going through trial. So the way that the jail was set up, where I was at, the men who were going through trial were placed in a special cell next to where the women prisoners were held. So not long after the man that I shot testified, I'm sitting in this cell waiting to go into court, and guess who walks through the door? It was my mom. During that time I committed my crime, my mom had gotten into some more trouble with the law. So at that time, I was going through trial. She had recently been arrested and was going to court too. This was the first time that I seen my mom in over a year. So when my mom sees me, she immediately breaks down. She was completely distraught, and just the fear in her eyes was devastating for me. I could see how she felt completely responsible for my situation. So then she starts to go on about how it was wrong for this to be happening to an innocent child. She really believed that I had nothing to do with this because up until that point, I had completely denied everything. So I had to tell my mom the truth. I told her that not only was I not innocent, but that I was actually completely responsible for shooting that man, and that I was probably going to prison for the rest of my life. After I told my mom this, she just got quiet, and we sat across from each other in those cells in silence until they came and took me back into court for trial. I wouldn't see my mom again for another 10 years. That night when I got back to my cell, I was up all night. One thing was on my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept thinking, if I were to die, the only thing that I'm going to be remembered for is shooting this man. I didn't want that to be my legacy. So that night I decided I was done with hurting people and I was done with being violent. Now I knew I couldn't erase what I had done, and I knew that I was going to be making amends for the rest of my life. But I was committed to changing, and so I decided to do so. So my trial ended with me being convicted of assault with a firearm. I was sentenced to 27 years to life. And I was 18 years old when I was sent to prison. Now, when I got to prison, I got sent to prison. It was like the stuff you see on TV. Everything about this place was extreme. Literally, the day that I got there, I watched a man get stabbed and have to fight for his life. Now, fighting is one thing, but fighting for your life is another thing completely. And as it was happening, I remember thinking to myself, this is what I get. By shooting that man, the second I pulled the trigger, this is what I signed up for. I was solely responsible for putting myself in that place. And so I knew that it was going to be up to me to get myself out. So pretty early into my incarceration, I figured that it was going to take some pretty creative, outside of the box thinking to get out. So I spent some time sitting back and paying attention until I got a firm understanding of just how things worked at that prison. And I discovered a few things. First thing I discovered was that the value of human life there was very cheap. And I say that because of the frequency with which I saw people stab each other. I hardly ever seen a fist fight. People settled confrontations, disagreements, misunderstandings with stabbing each other. The next thing that I discovered was that the prison was designed to keep you there. It was a trap. So again, stabbings were a frequent occurrence, and in order to legitimately protect yourself, you needed a knife. Because if guys believed that you didn't have a knife, you were more likely to be victimized. But the way that the prison was ran was if you carried a knife, it was inevitable that you were gonna get caught with it, which would ruin your chances of getting transferred to a safer, less violent prison. So you needed a knife to legitimately stay safe, but if you carried that knife, you were gonna get caught with it, which ultimately would keep you at that prison longer. I knew guys who had been at that prison for 20 years. Another thing that I came to discover was that nobody ever went home from that prison. A guy that I met had been at that prison again for 20 years, and he had never seen anybody parole from that prison. And then I asked a guard who had been working at the prison since it opened, and he had never seen anybody parole. And so the popular sentiment of the guys doing time there was one of hopelessness. I would hear guys say all the time, we might as well make the best of this because they ain't never gonna let us out. So after reaching these shocking conclusions, first thing I thought was, this is crazy. And then I started to devise a plan that would get me transferred to a safer prison. And I had to think outside the box. So the first part of this plan was one, don't carry a knife, because getting caught with a knife would ruin my chances of being transferred to somewhere safer and less crazy. Two, minimize my time on a recreation yard, because this is where all of the violence was more likely to occur. And then three, start hanging around positive people who had hope and who believed that they would get out of prison. Now, I was aware that not having a knife, avoiding a yard, and wanting to associate with more positive people could have easily been perceived as me being a coward, which was dangerous. So I needed a really good reason that could justify me doing these things? Well, the reason came in the form of what kind of turned into an obsession. I became somewhat obsessed with the law. So it just occurred to me one day that I really didn't know what happened at my trial, the process of it, the procedures. I didn't know nothing. All I knew was that I got convicted and I got life. So I started spending hours, day and night, poring over the thousands of court transcripts that I had from my trial that were in my cell. Guys would come by my cell, see me buried in paperwork, and just keep going about their business. And then I learned that every single prison in California has a legal library, and it's a law that every prisoner has access to it. Now, there are 3 places, at least at every prison I've been to, where violence and the politics of the yard don't exist. There's an unspoken understanding that says we will agree to be peaceful for the limited time that we occupy these spaces. The first place is the visiting room where guys' families come to see them. The second place is the chapel where people go to worship. And the third place was the legal library. Now, the library was one of the most secure places at the prison. And as it turned out, the prison legal community is where all the bright and innovative minds basically went to conspire. I met guys who had gotten their own life sentences reversed. I met certified paralegals. I met former practicing attorneys. I met some truly brilliant people. And for the first time in a long time, I found a community that truly accepted me. They taught me, they encouraged me, and they embraced me. So I began to get an understanding of the law and the prison system. And I learned why the pen is so much more mightier than the sword. But also, the legal library fit perfectly into my plan. It was crazy secure, so there was no way that anyone was getting a knife there, so I definitely didn't need one. I could spend huge chunks of my day there, which kept me off of the recreational yard. And it was full of like-minded individuals who had hope. So I'm coming back from the legal library one day, and a group of guys that I knew were waiting for me. They hadn't seen me around in the yard, and they wanted to know where I had been. Now, this was a tense moment, and my mind was racing for potential outcomes. So I told them the truth. I told them that I'd been going to the legal library, and I was trying to do everything that I could to get myself out of prison. Now, to be honest, their reaction was not what I was expecting. They wanted to know if I had found anything that could help them. You see, in my experience, the average prisoner is completely ignorant to the law. And although it didn't seem like it on the surface at first, the truth of the matter is, everybody was looking for hope. So I became one of those guys that people would come to for legal advice. So I stuck to my plan for 5 years. And it took focus, it took commitment, and it took me seeing an opportunity where others couldn't. And eventually, I was transferred to a medium security prison. And so fast forward through that, and eventually, I found myself at San Quentin State Prison. So after being at San Quentin for a few days, I decided that that was going to be the last prison that I served time at. San Quentin was a place that was rich with opportunity and possibility. In terms of self-help groups and rehabilitative programs, this was the Mecca. Where most prisons have 2 or 3 such programs, which is usually Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous, San Quentin had more than 70. And these programs range in everything from restorative justice to film and audio production. They even had a college program that gave you the opportunity to get an associate's degree for absolutely free. So I wound up getting involved with the media program, and I began learning not just film and audio production, but also the power of storytelling. I developed a passion for telling the stories of the people around me. Then, while I was taking a business class, I ran across the concept of entrepreneurship, and it was something mad familiar about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs reminded me of cats in the street. They had a way of thinking that allowed them to see opportunities that others couldn't. They tended to be very ambitious people who thought outside of the box. So the more I learned about entrepreneurship, the more excited I got, because I came to realize that this was the outlet that somebody like me needed. With entrepreneurship, I could take all the survival skills and life lessons that I learned in the streets and apply it to something positive, something that didn't have to involve me coming back to jail or worse. So I started to look at my life through an entrepreneurial lens. And after viewing the world through this context, I realized that, I was the business. And my business needed to scale. So I started to do things that add value to my business. I applied to the college program. I got an associate's degree. I began investing serious time into self-help programs that focused on me being accountable and taking responsibility for the harm that I caused. I found unique ways to grow my business, which meant building a network of credible people who could support and vouch for me. In this regard, I started doing things that would get the attention of the big wigs in the prison system. I wrote and produced a number of PSAs for California's Department of Corrections. These PSAs aired in every prison, and I got the attention and support of some really important people in the prison system. I focused on building up San Quentin's media program, which led me to being voted to be chairman of the first chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists in a prison. I produced audio shows for a San Francisco NPR affiliate. I curated a TEDx event where we managed to get a former United States Treasury Secretary to speak. I also gave a talk myself on entrepreneurship at this event. Needless to say, I got busy, and I became an evangelist for my own unique style of entrepreneurship. And I love to talk about why I believed how it could serve as a realistic alternative to the street life. So I'm going along doing my thing. Then a couple of Silicon Valley venture capitalists started an entrepreneurship program at San Quentin. And of course, I was one of the first people to sign up. While participating in this program, not only did I start to meet extremely successful entrepreneurs, I started meeting entrepreneurs who ran tech companies. Prior to this, I had no idea that some of the biggest ballers in the world were in tech. But they are. And the more I learned about this world, the more fascinated I became. Then I started to learn about programming and all of the different languages that are available. So from there, it was a no-brainer. I knew that's what I wanted to pursue. I wanted to be in tech, but more importantly, I wanted to encourage other people like me to do the same thing. Now, my introduction to Python is fairly recent, and it came about in a pretty unique way. I got introduced to Python by way of journalism, of all things. In 2017, during a Society of Professional Journalists meeting, I met Jessica McKellar. Now, Jessica McKellar is many things, but a journalist she is not. So in a room full of journalists, she kind of stands out. This led to us having a conversation, and as it turns out, not only was she an MIT educated programmer, but she is also a very successful entrepreneur. So I expressed to her my newfound interest in programming, and she starts to tell me about Python. She tells me about how and why it's such a powerful language, and that it's also a great language to learn for someone starting out. And then it gets a little bit crazy. Jessica tells me about these tutorials that she had did for this company called O'Reilly Media, and how it would be great if I had access to them. Well, it just so happens that it is a small world because I had recently met the founder of O'Reilly Media, Tim O'Reilly, and I knew that he had donated a bunch of tablets to the prison that were filled with O'Reilly Media content. I wound up getting access to a tablet which had Jessica's Python tutorials on it, and that's how I began learning how to code. After this point, I started meeting with Jessica pretty frequently, and she began to tell me about not just the concept of open source, but also about the Python community. Now, to be honest, at first I did not believe her. I just couldn't fathom that a person would create a potentially lucrative piece of software and then turn it over to the public so that everybody could use it for free. But what really blew me away is what happens after that. From that selfless act, a community was born. And this community takes this software, and from the spirit of collaboration and fellowship, they improve this software and share those improvements with each other. And they keep on doing this. But this community welcomes everybody, and the only criteria for membership is basically that you use this unfettered access to continue to collaborate and keep improving the software. But the key is that everyone is welcome. And I know this may sound a little bit cheesy, but to me, this is the very definition of love. Love by way of collaboration and acceptance. Love by way of peer education. Love by way of access. So after hearing this, I wanted in. And I couldn't wait for the day when I would get the opportunity to join this community. So I continued my education with Python and was able to draw from the vast wealth of knowledge that has been compiled by the open source community. And then, on August 17th of 2018, this past year, I received a call from the governor's office. I was told that everything that I've been doing was being recognized and that my 27-year-to-life sentence was being commuted. So I'm like, cool. But what does that mean? And so they're like, in about 7 days, you get to go home. So you know what was the first thing that came to my mind when I heard this? My plan worked. I'm dope. This was the first thing I thought. So 7 days later, on August 24th, 2018, I was released from prison after serving 19 years on a 27-year-to-life sentence. But here's the reality of my situation and why I believe that the open source and Python community are so special. I'm a 37-year-old, black, convicted felon with no work history. There aren't many professions that exist where I won't be at the mercy of the stigmas and biases that will inevitably accompany my past. But one of the few exceptions is programming. With programming, in my experience, more often than not, these barriers don't exist. You either can do the work or you can't, irregardless of your past. And what makes the Python community so special to people like me is that the community prides itself on diversity and access. Education is spread openly and freely, and encouragement and collaboration are at the community's very foundation. And I think that the spirit of this community and why it all fits together so perfectly is inclusion. Everybody is welcome. So with that, I want to humbly challenge you to expand your thinking around inclusion. I stand before you today as the representative of a demographic that most people don't think about, formerly incarcerated people. But we exist and we are eager to prove ourselves. And above all, we want to be accepted. There are many challenges that await us upon our reentry back into society. And I ask you all, as members of the Python community, to be open, to be thoughtful, and to welcome us. And you never know. You may be surprised, because you may find that a few of us are actually kind of dope. Thank you all so much.